I went to the desk that I was covering, for whatever reason, I would wrap my feet around the base of the chair, and that's about when the bomb blast happened.
It was the scariest, most strangest sound I could ever hear. I mean, you hear windows busting open. It sounded like someone was knocking down a forest or something.
Human beings go through life thinking they're not at risk. We don't live on a safe planet. It's never been safe. It never will be safe. The only place it's safe on this planet is in the gray matter we call the human brain.
Unfortunately, I think that sometimes the way we talk about disasters cultivates fatalism instead of resilience, cultivates fear instead of strength. And this doesn't have to be this way.
In these really terrible emergency situations, you're actually kicked into a different operating range. And we don't always know the kind of person we're going to be in that situation. Some people know how to take control, some people panic and scream, others freeze.
There are reasons your brain is doing this to help you. But particularly in very modern kinds of disasters, it can be unhelpful, unless you know to expect them or you've trained to override them. I worked for Time magazine as a writer covering crime and disasters, and survivors of disasters were telling me these really fascinating and surprising things that were really useful, too, about what it felt like physically and emotionally and even socially to go through a disaster. A few years after 9/11, I went to a support group for survivors of the World Trade Center, people who had evacuated. There were, after all, about 15,000 people who did evacuate the World Trade Center, and I wondered, if they were functioning well, what was going on with them. While there was clearly trauma and suffering in the room, there was also a really proactive sense of wanting to share what they had learned. There were things that they wished they had known before 9/11, and they want everyone else to know those things.
I went into work and I walk around the concourse and I'm making my way onto the elevator banks. And as I get there, a woman comes running by screaming that there's a bomb in the building. And so I froze because immediately I thought back to the 1993 bombing, which I survived as well. People started to just say, run. And I still froze because I'm thinking bomb, landmines, I don't want to step on something, God forbid something blow up. And next thing I know, people were pushing and shoving, just trying to get back out of the concourse.
I walked over to the window of my partner's office, and when I looked out the window, what I saw was burning paper, and I just felt the inkling that we needed to leave. And so what I began to do is I walked back out of my partner's office, walked to my assistants and said, let's go. The 44th floor, for anyone that knows about the World Trade Center, was the common walkway where you could either go upstairs or come back downstairs. So I was on my way back upstairs because they had been making that announcement that everything was fine. Got on the elevator, and right before the elevator closed, I had an inkling to get off the elevator. Not even 30 seconds later, Tower 2 was hit. The elevators came crashing down, and it caused fire and explosion. And what seemed like forever, all of a sudden just came to this real serious calm. And I began to walk over to a doorway that I didn't even know was there, because I realized we never look at our surroundings just to see a way of escape. I went to this evacuation of this staircase, and I began to walk down the stairway. And at that time, where you normally would think that it would be stampeding and chaos, it wasn't any of that.
To me, it didn't make any sense that I was trying to move and I heard move, but my body would not respond. I literally stood still. And I just kept thinking, why am I hearing run, but my body is not hearing run and my body's not responding? It was like I was watching a movie in slow motion. And even though the scene was chaotic, people were running, people were just trying to escape. It was like, because I was paralyzed with fear and confusion, that everything seemed to slow down around me. I couldn't move fast enough.
What happens is a part of your brain called the amygdala kicks into gear, and that's essentially your emergency control center. And so it commandeers all the other parts of your brain to say, everybody pay attention, something important is going down here. It's merely an issue of you're so focused on what's going on that you can pull in details in a way that you can't normally, but it doesn't actually last longer in terms of perceptual time.
Turns out that I think that their experiences were even more transferable than they had thought. The actual phases that your brain goes through and the distortions, the sensory distortions you experience, those are universal. The first phase is almost always a very profound period of denial or disbelief, where your brain works very hard and very creatively to come up with explanations for what's happening that are calming or soothing, not upsetting, normalizing the situation. The second phase that most people go through is a phase of deliberation, where people become very, very social. And this is common in all kinds of disasters, whether they're sinking cruise ships or in train bombings. It doesn't matter whether you know people or whether you're strangers. People tend to form groups. They talk to each other, they exchange information, and they stay in groups. So it's very different from how people behave at rush hour on the highway. And then the third phase is what I call the decisive moment, which is where you actually take action, or more often than not, fail to take action, which is very common. And what happens in that phase is really determined by what happened in the first two phases of denial and deliberation, but also everything that's happened to you before in your life and how much experience you have dealing with these kinds of events and how much knowledge you have. I found that the people who knew the most about human behavior under extreme stress were actually people who worked in the aviation safety industry. They have psychologists who work at the FAA and who think about this stuff, and in a way that, we do not do for building fires or things that are much more common. So I went to Oklahoma City to go through the training that flight attendants go through.
When people are put into stressful situations,
It's realistic, and it is something that makes your brain, to a smaller degree, go through some of the same phases that you would go through in a real event. I do wish everybody could do it because, when that plane fills with smoke, it happens really fast. And so you start to appreciate why it's useful to think about where the exit might be, not just in a plane, but anywhere, because you're just not going to be able to navigate.
the reasons that people say they don't listen to the safety briefings are, I already know it all. I'm a frequent flyer. It's common knowledge. We're not going to be in an accident, and if we are, I'm dead. It doesn't really matter. And that's just not the way it is. Probably the biggest hurdle that we have in cabin safety research is figuring out how to get passengers to pay attention and then to get the information that they receive and incorporate it into their knowledge base so that when the time comes, they can retrieve it and actually behave in a productive system just to be able to survive, maybe to help others. Accidents rarely happen, but there's something that you can do to help yourself survive. There is a general feeling that if you focus on emergency procedures too much, then people are going to be afraid and they're not going to fly. That is not the case. The better prepared people are, the more confident they're going to feel, the less afraid they're going to be, and the better they will do in an emergency.
How often do you release that seatbelt in the jump seat?
We know that in a stressful situation, we revert to what we know. What we know about seatbelts is you push a button. You don't lift a latch. And so in a stressful situation, most people are probably more inclined to look for a button to push, even though they've just latched a seatbelt. Seatbelts are not installed the same way on every plane and on every seat. Some latch to one side, others latch to the other side.
Or this way?
We did our own study on precautionary evacuations, and it showed that about once a week there was a precautionary evacuation. As part of the evacuation exercise, we want the participants to develop a roadmap in their minds of what they have to do to get from their seats to the exit. When we take away all the light and we add some smoke, that people can still maneuver through this unfamiliar territory, but that we want them to become familiar with.
Brace for impact.
Evacuate! Evacuate! Evacuate!
Seatbelts and get out.
Survival psychologists have for years been looking at the human factors of disaster and emergency situations. We know 10 to 15% of people are going to respond in a calm, cool, and collected manner. We know that 10 to 15% are going to be exactly the opposite, that they're going to respond irrationally, that whatever they do is not going to be productive. And then about 75% are a little stunned and bewildered, but eventually they'll come out of it.
If you're the crew training to deal with emergencies, you would train very differently for that kind of behavior than you would train for people going crazy and stampeding each other in the plane.
You talk about actual rehearsal. There's also mental rehearsal. This happened in probably the worst airplane disaster in history in the island of Tenerife in 1977.
We just know that there has been an accident.
Two of the survivors were Floy and Paul Heck.
He had been in a theater fire when he was a child, so you can imagine that it was a very traumatic experience. As a result, he studied the evacuation routes. He walked the evacuation route, so he had a good map in his mind of how to get out.
Suddenly, with absolutely no warning at all, the ceiling fell in, the plane sort of exploded, the seats simply left their moorings, and at the same time there was terrific fire and smoke.
The day of the accident, he had taken his wife. They had walked through the plane. He had pointed out where the exits were before they took off. Now, all of a sudden, they have to find the exit. He was up and ready to go. His wife kind of froze for a few seconds, but he was able to shake her out of her bewilderment, and off they went.
When people think about how they're going to react to a disaster, they often think the phrase flight or fight. And I actually think that neither of those two things are common. Other than rhyming, I'm not sure what value they add, because what you actually see much more common is a sort of slowing down or freezing, stopping altogether. That is much more common than panic, than fighting, than fleeing. And it's really important, I think, to understand, because we can override that, but it's incredibly common.
This behavioral inaction is a killer in certain airplane accidents.
You can do things that will put you in the right mindset to give you a bias for action. Having been through that experience, now every time I get on a plane, it's just a matter of course, I count the number of rows between me and the nearest exit. Because I know that in an actual event, you may not be able to see your hand in front of your face because of the smoke, and so you need to be able to just count with your hands to figure out where the exit is. And it literally takes 30 seconds, and it's just a matter of kind of awareness, of being responsible for where you are and how to get out of places. The chances of being in a plane crash are so incredibly small. But I feel like the more valuable mindset that it supports is that, one that says, you know what, I have some control over what happens to me on this planet, and whether I'm right or wrong, that's a really healthy attitude to have. Richard Gist is really unusual and important because he's a psychologist that works with a fire department. You don't always see those two things mix. He understands human behavior and understands firefighters and has this mindset that's really valuable in understanding the gaps between what we expect to happen in fires and what actually happens.
Here's what happens if you don't prepare. You're most likely to experience a residential fire between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Odds are you'll be asleep.
It was really early in the morning, around 2:30. My parents, my brother, and I were sleeping upstairs. The smoke essentially woke my brother up. He started screaming, and so I woke up from his screams. I looked outside, and I honestly thought that the sun was rising on the opposite side of the sky.
Psychologists call this normalcy bias, and people come up with all kinds of creative ways to do this. You will find yourself doing this. You always try to diminish what's happening. Even if there's smoke, you will try to talk yourself out of thinking this is a big deal. And that's partly because it's never been a big deal before, right? So your brain functions by pattern recognition. And if you've never been in an event like this before, which chances are you haven't, then you will try to fit it into everything that's happened to you before. And that can be dangerous.
I opened my door, this monstrous cloud of smoke just came towards me. And my brother was just crying and screaming. And this smoke felt like someone was shoving barbed wire down your throat. It was terrible. When I was younger, the firefighters do the old school trip. I always remember them coming into our room and telling us how serious it was and that we need to get the washcloth. We need to crawl on the floor. We need to do this. We need to do that. And it just transferred over. I closed my door and I took a deep breath and I thought, just go to the bathroom. Go and find a towel, go wet it, put it on your mouth. I found a towel, wet it, put it on my mouth, opened the door. When there is smoke, there is a clear line, the smoke and then clean air. And it's bizarre how apparent that is. I just got straight down, put the thing over my mouth, and I was crawling. And every now and then I would put the towel down, trying to say words of encouragement to my brother. I was calm, completely calm the whole time. I met my dad's feet, and his feet literally hit my face. And he picked me up and we ran for it. The moments before I was with my parents, it's that feeling you get when you're a child in a grocery store and you lost your parents. When I saw my mom and dad with me, it was like relief. And as we were yelling for help, my dad was coming in, taking a deep breath, and then going back and forth to get my brother, to try and get him. My dad just came back and he said, "We're gonna have to jump." And I was like, oh my God, this is a 2-story building. They lifted me right outside the window ledge. It was a really long shot down, and I just all of a sudden went, and then I got knocked out. I talked to the firefighters later, and that gasp I inhaled, that was carbon monoxide, which naturally knocks you out. And I woke up on top of an air conditioning unit, and I rolled off. I felt glass all down my body. I felt it sticking through everything. Then all of a sudden I hear kind of like something falling, and it was my mom. And I looked over and I said, Mom, we have to go. We have to get out of here. Then all of a sudden, the window right above us from the ledge exploded on us. There was faulty wiring, a flickering of lights, but it was character. We thought it was cute. We never checked it, and I guess it just ignited in a bathroom down right below my parents' bedroom. There was smoke detectors, of course, but they were beeping because the batteries were not replaced. And so essentially we just yanked them out of the wall, because we were like, oh, that noise is so annoying. We didn't We didn't think about any of that.
Smoke detectors are very cheap, very available technology. The units themselves may be as little as $5, the batteries within them less than $1, and yet more than 60% of our residential deaths are involved in a home in which there is no smoke detector or one not functioning.
I always remember nights sitting on the couch and cuddling with her. I never wanted to go to bed at my bedtime. She was like a mama bear. Yeah, she would always be there. My dad was about 6 paces from the window. He died of carbon monoxide. He was in the house trying to get my brother, no matter what. We used to always blast like Bob Marley, and he would be putting on a good curry, and he would just be dancing, and he was the funniest man, probably the funniest man I'll ever meet. We always get to wake up on Saturday morning and watch cartoons and eat cereal. It's like you're used to someone being next to you all the time, and then all of a sudden they're gone. My sister, she was away at college, thank God. We have shared something so deep in this whole trauma that my family has experienced that we are really close.
Most people, when they think about fire, they think that a fire is what would kill them. If you die in a fire, you die pretty much usually from the smoke. Smoke moves very quickly and is very disorienting. So unless you literally can navigate out of a place without seeing your hand in front of your face, literally in a blindfold, then you probably are going to have a hard time getting out of a place in a fire. So that's why it's so important to actually physically go through fire drills, because you won't have the normal sensory cues. You won't be able to see, you won't be able to breathe very well. It's disorienting. Since most fires happen at night, you may be, sort of woken up. And a lot of people die just from sitting up in bed when they wake up. And at that level, the smoke is really toxic. If you can plan for that and train for it, you're just going to do better.
Without a doubt, the prime way to motivate people to prepare is if people they know, like their friends and relatives, share with them, show them, and tell them about what they've done to prepare.
I think telling people what has happened to me, why it has happened, why their deaths could have been prevented, I think that really brings them to be serious about it. Because if I was standing there and saying to them, I am hurt right now, I'm hurting, and you don't have to be where I'm at if you do this.
Probably the biggest mistake that we all make is spending a lot of time on talking about emergencies and not actually physically training for them. I mean, when I say training, I don't mean, get into your hazmat suit and jump out of planes. I mean, physically walking down the stairs of a building, physically, hearing a smoke detector when you're not expecting it and leaving the building. This kind of muscle memory is really, really valuable because you won't have the luxury of time and normal thought processes in an actual event. If you're going to have a fire drill, you want to make it surprise, you want to make it mandatory, and you want to make it physical, where you actually have to go outside. I would argue that if you don't do all 3 of those things, you probably can find a better way to spend your time.
We learn by doing, and especially under great pressure and great stress, we revert to that level of behavior if we're going to survive. If you have to wait until you've thought in order to move, too often the time you need to affect your own survival will have been lost, and the choice you make will be about as good as flipping a coin.
Los Angeles tonight, battered and bracing for the worst.
The earth is literally split here.
Shock leads to aftershock.
One of the surprising things is that there's really almost nothing we can't predict about disasters at this point. We've gotten really good at forecasting disasters. We can't always say exactly when earthquakes will strike or exactly where hurricanes will make landfall, but we pretty much know what they look like. So then the questions become, well, why don't we do more to plan for things we can predict? Dennis Maletti is a veteran of emergency management. He knows all about risk, and yet he lives on top of one of the most active and dangerous fault lines in California. And he does this with his eyes wide open.
People perceive risk like this. Disasters aren't going to happen. And if they do, they'll happen to someone else, not me. That's how human beings are wired. Fear doesn't motivate. In fact, it turns people off. What you need to educate people about isn't the hazard. It's about preparedness. So if you want people to prepare, what there is to communicate is what they should do to prepare. Why? Big question mark. Because things happen.
When I was trying to find people who understood the brain under stress, I read this little article about a company in Colorado that was trying to teach kids how to drive according to how their brains actually work. And I thought, wow, what a radical concept. Because as with emergency preparedness, we don't really consider how the brain actually works when we teach kids how to drive. And this is an incredibly dangerous thing, way, way more deadly than sharks or hurricanes. Ron is himself a survivor. He was a race car driver coach for many, many years when his young daughter was killed in a tragic car accident hit by another driver. Not her fault. And he realized after coming home from the hospital that he could spend the rest of his life just filled with hatred and resentment for this other driver. And he decided not to do that.
A parent experiences that kind of thing and you think, golly, somebody ought to do something. So we started really looking at what teenagers learn, what they don't learn. And even though more kids, more teens are killed and injured in car crashes than the total of the other things, we still don't do anything really to prepare a teenager to become a driver in this country.
He really devoted himself to two things: understanding how the brain works and explaining it to kids and drivers, but also teaching them by doing. And that just sitting in a room talking about safe driving is not a great use of time.
It's an immersion for that child in the car doing specific skills development. And they really learn a lot about how to control a car, what's the limitations of a car, limitations of units of traction, decision making, to make a reaction to a crisis situation. And they have to get the programming in the brain to be able to do that subconsciously.
The brain is all about creating a model of the real world, and if you haven't seen the real world, if you don't really know the circumstances that you have to deal with, it's very hard to come up with an intelligent or appropriate response to the highly unpredictable. And the only way we can have any reliable response is to have some practice, some rehearsal, some understanding of how appropriate reaction might guide us through a situation.
One of the most important exercises that we do, we call it a crash avoidance exercise. And we have an LED light system at the far end of that has an LED light in each lane, which represents something just happened in those two lanes and they're blocked, and therefore you have to go over to the open lane. Now, what most people do in a crisis, they look at the crash, focus on it, and we have a tendency to drive into it.
When you actually look at the accidents that a young driver has when they're practicing these behaviors, they commonly drive into things right in front of them.
Training the eyes look for the solution, and then to be able to take the car there quickly without losing dynamic control of the car, that is, without panicking and jerking the car out of control, it's really an art form. But in today's world of driving, it is absolutely necessary to be able to respond.
I stack the deck as full as I can for my children in any way I can. And so I thought the more experience they get, the better. And so I put them through the master drive.
Candy, her daughter, Taylor, who was 16 at the time, she's driving the family Suburban at a busy time of day in Denver, comes into an intersection and the brakes totally fail.
It was traffic hour, and she said she was going 40 to 50 miles per hour. At the time, traffic stopped suddenly in front of her, and she put her foot to the floor and said she had no response whatsoever.
And the real question becomes one of, okay, so what would most people do in that situation? And you know what most people would do is just, A braking exercise that we use to train the teenager to squeeze the brake. She, with her left foot, went to the parking brake, squeezed it, brought the car under control, and stopped and never hit anybody.
Somewhere she had put the puzzle together through master drive and automatically had done it.
We didn't teach her how to do that, per se. Her brain took it over to this pedal, and she threshold braked that Suburban down and stopped it and never hit anybody. And it is a miracle that she was able to do that.
Well, the brain is a function of our experiences, isn't it? So we are who we have been. So everything that we've experienced and have learned gets assimilated into our memories and prepares us to react to a similar situation.
One of the most critical lessons that survivors have to share, which is everyone needs to be responsible for some level of resilience and understanding of their environment and the risks that they live with, because no one is going to be there.
My wife was about 7 months pregnant, and it was one of those things that we decided, well, we could squeeze in this vacation before then. I was at a point in my academic career where I could afford a few weeks off, and so we scraped up every single nickel that we had, and we took this trip. The Athens to New York flight was canceled, for reasons I still don't think I know. There were 2 seats left on that plane from Athens to Rome, and we got on it. And that was bad luck. I was on the left side of the plane, and I saw 2 people running up the aisle. And one of them had a chrome-plated pistol, and the other one had a hand grenade. And there was yelling. And at that point, I realized this wasn't going well. And I turned around, and I said to my wife, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." And she burst out crying. There's no talking at all. It is the most disorienting, frightening, unpleasant experience you could wish on anybody, because you have no idea where this is headed. Every bit of information that you have is internal, and you don't have any. There's no external stimuli except bad people. One of the problems was we were flying constantly, and the plane needed refueling. The hijackers were trying to get the plane refueled, but the airports didn't want us to even land, because who wants a hijack situation on their airport tarmac? And so they would try to keep us from landing. I actually remember one particular landing where the pilot came on and said over the loudspeaker, "There's a truck parked on the runway to prevent us from landing. We are landing anyway."
He has pulled a hand grenade pin and he is ready to blow up the aircraft if he has to. We must, I repeat, we must land at Beirut. We must land at Beirut. No alternative.
They moved the truck at the last moment, and we land at the airport. Of course, the airport didn't want us there, and they didn't want to give us fuel to contribute to the situation.
They are threatening to kill him now. They are threatening to kill him now. We want the fuel now, immediately.
At one point, there was a gunshot. Somebody was killed. His name was Bobby Steedham, And he sat behind me, and he was a CB, which is a construction battalion in the military.
He will open the door and kill the passengers out onto the ramp immediately.
And when they wouldn't provide gasoline, they shot him and dumped him out the front door. And then they provided gasoline. During the acute phase, you're very aware. You are very heightened in all your senses. Your hearing and your eyes are dilated, the whole stress response you get. But as it continued, and the resignation sets in, and the sadness sets in, and the sort of constant fear sets in, I think my experience is somewhat unique, but there are lots of people that have undergone horrific experiences. And so for me, having gone through that, I did not want it to be the center focus of my thinking in any way.
While Dr. Toga's experiences have not defined his life, he knows that neurology has played a significant role in his ability to cope.
It would come up in the oddest times, that I would just remember some aspect of it, just spontaneously and unexpectedly.
Normally, an area of the brain called the hippocampus is involved in consolidating memories and laying things down. But it turns out your normal memory is actually quite leaky. You don't remember most of what comes in and out. In contrast, when an emergency situation is happening, the amygdala kicks into gear, and this lays down memories on what amounts to a secondary memory track. And these are the memories of post-traumatic stress disorder. These are the flashbulb memories that people have of a really scary or traumatic event. It's a totally different system. It turns out that these fear memories are unerasable, unlike other normal hippocampal memories. So the best you can do is develop other circuitry in your brain to squelch those scary memories, but they never get erased.
The brain doesn't respond to any experience. You relate it to all of your experiences. We are our experiences. That's who we are. And this was one for me. This was one in a lifetime of them. And the majority of them have been pleasant and rewarding and fulfilling. And this one was the opposite. And so why would I allow this one, or why should this one have a disproportional influence on who I am compared to all the others?
Christian survived the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia. He was on vacation with friends in a beautiful resort in Thailand, and he tells a very powerful story about this experience.
I was spending Christmas with friends in Phi Phi Island. It's a beautiful place. It's a crystal clear water, coconut trees. We were having a lot of fun, and it was a great ambience, and we were forgetting about the world. So I woke up that morning with the earthquake.
As a little kid, I guess he'd read a cartoon or something, comic book about tsunami, and he got really frightened of them and started reading more and more about these giant waves and how it works. And he knew that they were caused by earthquakes.
I've been afraid of that, but there was nothing coming, so I thought, okay, it's only in Hollywood movies. I just went back to sleep, and around 9:30, my friend and I, we went to breakfast on the beach, and we stayed there for about an hour. It was very relaxing. We're playing with a little cat on the beach. And then we went back to our room at 10:30 because we had to check out. And the waves struck at 10:35, and we were in our room. There was a lot of noise, and I felt like those are probably people checking out. And I kept packing, and the light went off, and I thought, okay, that's Thailand, it's a small island, it's okay. And then I went to the bathroom, and I tried to turn the tap on, and there was no water. So that's when I realized something must be really wrong. I went back outside again, and on the patio, outside my room, water had just come flushing my floor, maybe a few inches below my floor, and it was completely flooding the whole island. It's extremely shocking. Everything changes. Your whole normal environment collapses. You're not prepared to that. All of a sudden, you're on a different planet. And you've been transposed there without any transition.
But he lives with this incredible sense of guilt. He feels that he could have evacuated the resort because he knew that earthquakes cause tsunami, and no matter what you tell him, he feels responsible for those deaths of many people.
Maybe a month after the tsunami, I came on the scene of a major bus crash.
It was right afterward. Because of his experience not taking action, he handled this time very differently. And what he did is he immediately became a leader. He started screaming at the bystanders, "You have to help these people. Come on, these people need our help." And everybody followed his orders, just like people do. And he went in and he just started pulling people out of this wreckage.
I felt like I was on a mission. So I'm convinced that you can train. And I was trained to tell myself not to stand by anymore, and that I needed to be proactive. So I don't think it's very difficult. And what really pushed me to do something on the car crash, on the bus crash, was the guilt. Because that's the most horrible feeling you can have. It's very insidious. It stays with you. It sticks to your skin forever, that you haven't done anything. You should do something, and you haven't done enough. And you have survived.
And the hospital was quite a distance away. And he said the one moment of solace that he had was looking in his rearview mirror as he pulled up to the hospital, and he saw this long chain of cars of other people who were carrying other injured people, following his lead. And he felt like, okay, this time he had done something. It turns out that what you do in the midst of a disaster is really important, not just for surviving that particular disaster, but for recovering fully afterwards. Because you don't just want to survive in a technical sense. I mean, you want to be able to thrive one day. And so it turns out that if you actually take action and perform some function and feel like you did something, even if it wasn't perfect, then that tends to improve your chances of thriving afterward, of not suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, of feeling like the technical phrase is locus of control, but feeling like you have control. You have an internal locus of control over what happens in your life. Because if you don't feel that way, if you feel like anything can happen at any time, even if that's true, that's a very frightening, stressful, and debilitating way to live.
My experience on April 19th started as just a typical day. I was back at my desk getting my messages. One of my coworkers came up. She had just been promoted to management and wore what she thought was a power suit. She was pulling some files in the back, and she said, "What do you think of my suit?" Well, I knew that it was a real important day for her, and I didn't want to ruin it. And I said, "You look terrific," which kind of a white lie, but I just wanted her to feel confident when she went into the meeting. And after that, I wanted to go see what I was doing for lunch that day. I had typically went outside of the building every day for lunch just to kind of get out. Across the street, there was a plaza that we would go sit and have lunch, and I would go with a friend named Karen. So I stopped at her office and looked at her and said, "Hey, what are we doing?" And she gave me that look. She was on the phone, and she just, "I'll call you later." And when I went to the desk that I was covering, for whatever reason, I would wrap my feet around the base of the chair, and that's about when the bomb blast happened.
The floor from above went down, and it just kept falling. It was ugly. horrible noise. Horrible noise.
It happened so fast as far as hearing it. I didn't hear anything. As far as feeling it, it was just kind of like a suction, just a really fast fall. And when I first came to, I thought it was a really bad dream. I thought, okay, I'll just go back to sleep, and when I wake up, everything will be okay. I just felt like, dirt or something was on top of me. So I thought I must be in the bottom of a bad pileup. I had no idea what had happened to me. Since I thought I was in a car wreck, I thought my children were with me as well. And to be honest with you, I really, really feel that helped keep me alive. I thought, are you going to get my kids out too? And I would ask that periodically. I'd ask what happened and where are my babies. I come to the museum and I tell my story because it is history. And in a way, it helps me too. I mean, it is historical. The kids here in Oklahoma are studying it as part of Oklahoma history. Even though it's been so long, as far as memory, it helps me with my memory. I really do think that you should give back to society and live your life right. And I feel that is my obligation, to give back to the family members that lost their loved ones, to be here at this anniversary every year.
Do not put off the improbable to be the unthinkable. The fact that something is improbable is a limited benefit. If there's a 1 in a million chance of something happening to you, well, it's happening to 300 people in this country right now. Firefighters everywhere appreciate the amount of respect that their work was given following the September 11th losses. The most important thing to remember is what that man or woman who has taken up that calling has essentially said they will do, is they will exchange themselves for you if that's required. The way you make them safe is don't require it.
Sometimes the lights go out because of a fluke at a transformer. You need a flashlight. Sometimes there's a terrorist attack and the lights are going to go out. Get a flashlight. You're going to need it. Sometimes the lights are going to go out from an earthquake. Get a flashlight. You're going to need it. The Boy Scouts had it right. Most people know they were right when they said, be prepared.
After 9/11, the first plane trip I took was to Oklahoma City to learn a bit about what it was like for a city to recover from a mass casualty bombing. So while I was there, I talked to a man who had survived, and I remember we were standing out underneath the survivor's tree there that survived the blast. And he kind of turned the tables on me and he said, so how are you doing, Amanda? You live in New York and you just covered this major disaster. How are you doing? And I said, oh yeah, I'm okay, I'm very lucky, etc. And I said, the only thing is, I can't quite shake this feeling, that anything could happen at any time. I'm looking forward to that going away. And he said, you're right, anything could happen at any time. And it was always so. You just are aware of it now. I just didn't live with this awareness of what could be. And now I had that awareness. And it can be overwhelming and frightening, or it can be liberating, because you suddenly now know bad things can and do happen. And what I do matters.